Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Leddy Montague Jr. Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the law school. This series offers an opportunity to glean insights from top leaders in their fields. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journeys and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. I'm very pleased today to welcome Matthew Sagg, Professor of Law, Artificial Intelligence, Machine Learning, and Data Science at Emory University School of Law. He's an expert in copyright law and intellectual property. He was born and educated in Australia. He earned honours in law at the Australian National University in Canberra. He's clerked for Justice Paul Finn at the Australian Federal Court, practiced law in London, and was an associate at Arnold Porter in Silicon Valley and Skadden Arps. His research has been widely cited in academic works, court submissions, judicial opinions, and government reports. Also with us today is Tonja Jacobi, Professor of Law and Sam Nunn Chair in Ethics and Professionalism at Emory University School of Law. She has a doctoral degree in political science from Stanford University, master's from the University of California, Berkeley, and a law degree with first-class honors from the Australian National University. She specializes in Supreme Court judicial behavior and public law. Her areas of interest include judicial politics, Supreme Court oral arguments, criminal procedure, legislative process, and constitutional law. She combines doctrinal, empirical, and formal analysis and examines how judges respond to institutional constraints. She is a renowned expert in Supreme Court oral argument. In a series of empirical studies covering 60 years of arguments, she has identified patterns and prejudices in judicial and advocate behavior. She showed that case outcomes can be predicted based on these behaviors, and Supreme Court justices have commented on this work and said it has changed the court. Well, welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
I couldn't help but
Thanks,
notice
Dal.
that both of you have a connection with Australia and ANU.
That's true.
Why don't we start there and tell us about that connection?
Matt, do you want?
Sure. So I went to the ANU when I was 17 years old. I'd grown up in Adelaide and Brisbane. I went to the ANU to study economics and law, pretty firmly convinced that I was going to be an economist. And, you know, life doesn't work out the way you think it's going to. I met Tonja on the first day of classes, and, you know, the fact that we're both here is not a coincidence.
Claudia?
Yeah, that's right. So yes, I was 17 as well. We start law school. You can start law school in Australia as young as when you're a teenager. And Matt and I are a married couple as well as co-authors. And so we came over to the US together. I came originally to do my PhD in political science, and convinced Matt to come with me. And it's we both forged academic careers here together, which has been great, and we enjoy writing together. Yeah.
So let's talk about law school in Australia versus law school here. What have you noticed? Similarities, differences, anything interesting?
Well, I first became interested in judicial politics of the US Supreme Court because I was already studying law in Australia. And then I started reading Supreme Court cases as part of studying American politics. And to be honest, I noticed just how incredibly simple the US Supreme Court cases were compared to the Australian cases. So to give you a context, in Australia, we have a seriatim tradition, which means each justice ordinarily writes on their own. They don't have these joint opinions. There is occasionally one or two justices will get together to write an opinion together. And so that means rather than reading one or two or occasionally multiple concurrences, you read 7 opinions typically. And they also, the way that they spell out the issues is there's not the same need for essentially for compromise. So the tradition of having joint opinion writing means that justices have to compromise on substance in order to win votes. And so the result of that is that cases at the US Supreme Court, case opinions are much simpler because they're a product of that political compromise. And that's sort of the thing that got me first interested in studying Supreme Court, was that difference, just how much of a political institution the Supreme Court is compared to the Australian court. And actually recently I've come full circle and gone back and used the approaches I used to study the US Supreme Court to study the Australian court and see how true it is. Is there really that political difference? But yeah, so law school is very different in that way. It's also different, I think, because many of us are 17, 18, 19 years old and a bit less mature. And so it's a different cultural experience as well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Matt?
And, I should say, like, we went to law school in Australia in the 1990s, and things may have changed. But, the thing that I think is the major difference, certainly between the way we were trained and the way our students now are trained, is our training was a lot less practical. We were really taught how to write a brief. We weren't, you had to really look hard for sort of advocacy-based courses, or, there were no clinics when we went to law school. And I think that's something that has probably changed here as well. But I think the US legal education is a little bit more focused on, you should actually come out of law school being able to be a lawyer. I think we had a great education, but certainly, it's in those first couple of years of practice that you're like, oh, this is what I meant to be doing. And I think that's a little different. There's less Socratic method in Australia. There are more tutorials. So that sort of lends itself to a difference. But, I think when we went to law school, there was also a lot less debt, right? And I think that, that just changes the way, people's attitude to their study. I think it has a lot of implications. But I think over the past 20 odd years, like, the Australian legal education system has become more like the American system. How much more, I'm not exactly sure.
Is that a good thing?
In some ways, I think it's ridiculous to start a law degree when you're 17, right? That's just crazy. I think that, you should, it should be graduate. So I think that's good. I think to the extent that it requires taking on more and more debt, I think that's problematic. But then again, a law degree is a valuable thing. And, if you're getting all the benefits, there is a certain fairness in that you should pay for it as well.
But
yeah, I don't know.
Sorry. I'm torn on the question as to whether it's better to do it completely graduate. So the way we do it, it's not like the English system where you do a law degree as an undergraduate degree. You start your law degree at the same time as you do your undergraduate degree. So throughout your undergraduate degree, and then you do 2 years graduate as well. So you actually do more law in Australia, and you do it over a very gradual process. So you learn it over many more years. And I actually think that there's a lot to be said for that, not having everything sort of jammed in. In law school in America, third year is practically a write-off. People don't take it seriously. They have their jobs lined up. They just need to get through it. So really, they're learning most of their law in 2 years. And I'm sure for some people that's fine, but I felt like, even though at 17, I really didn't know what I was doing, but certainly by the end of it, I felt like I really understood legal analysis and legal methodology. And I think that is the real thing you're meant to learn from law school, is the process, because you can go and find out the facts for yourself. And I think learning that over many years actually, for me, was very valuable. And I learned it changed the way my brain processed. And I think that has a lot to be said for it. But at the same time, yeah, having 18-year-olds starting law school is is a little odd.
So now looking back, you talked about how it changed your brain. When you look at how our colleagues here in the United States think about issues, do you think the fact that you had the Australian education model, did that make a difference in how you would approach these issues compared to folks here?
Well, I also then came and did a US political science PhD, which also changed the way my brain thought in a different direction. So I think differently from being both a social scientist and a lawyer, as well as being Australian trained. I think that having the perspective of a foreigner is very valuable, particularly in the classroom rather than in research, maybe in research as well. But I find to be able to tell my students about I teach constitutional law and constitutional criminal procedure. And in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights. We barely have any written rights, but we have different norms as a way to protect rights, but it results in quite different outcomes. And I think showing this, there's a different approach to the American approach, and it has drawbacks, but it has advantages both ways, I think is very helpful. And there are some people who do sort of understand comparative systems, but most people don't. Most people are very focused on the US system. And I think that is valuable. I don't know if I necessarily analyze the law particularly differently. Maybe I do. I haven't really thought about that question. I'll think about that while Matt gives his perspective.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to realize that some things that are taken as axiomatic here are not axiomatic. And I think some international experience or outward focus certainly helps in that. I think I think one of the key skills of an academic is to look at what everyone else is looking at and just see it a little bit differently, and make connections that other people don't make. And there are lots of different ways to sort of coming to that skill, but one way is just having different experiences. And so to that extent, yeah, I think it's helpful.
Thanks. I want to come back to that transition afterwards, but I also don't want to miss out on that big thing that happens in between. So you guys graduate from law school, you got to think about what you want to do next. How did you decide?
So I really wanted to do a PhD in American politics. I had got this bug about like how different the US Supreme Court and the Australian court is, and I really wanted to study that. And at the time, actually, I just assumed that I would be a political science professor. And it was only when I was doing my PhD that I was like, oh, I could take this and be a law professor instead and have the best of both worlds. And so partly we came to the US, I really wanted to study American politics, so that made sense. But also, there's no doubt that in terms of graduate education, the US has the best system, like the best training. There's no comparison, I think. And so I think if I'd wanted to do something else other than American politics, I still would have wanted to come to the US because the PhDs here are, incomparable. And so that's how we came over, and Matt was working as a lawyer at that stage. And Matt has actually practiced in 3 different countries. And so he was working as a lawyer. He sat the California bar exam. I can brag about him because he won't. So he sat the California bar exam and passed when 1/3 of Californians were passing. So he started practicing it. That's when he started working at Skadden. And then once I finished my PhD, I'll hand over to him. But he started thinking about wanting to take a legal academic course as well.
Thanks. So, that's really part of the reason why we brought you here, Tonja, so that you can sing his praises and vice versa. Sometimes you hear about things you don't normally hear if you're sitting across the dining table.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so when Tonja finished her PhD, I'd been working at Skadden for 3 years, and I'd been working as a lawyer for almost 6 years plus a clerkship. And I was ready to do something different. And I think, if Tonja had gotten a job in California, I probably would have gone in-house for a tech company. And, you know, I think my life would be much poorer for it. But you know, with the opportunities she had, the places we were looking at, I really, you know, decided to sort of give one of these transitional academic roles a go, partly because I was just ready to do something else. I was ready for like different experiences, definitely ready to not be working at a large law firm billing in 6-minute increments. And or at least needed a break from that. Yeah. And then when I sort of got into the academic sort of lifestyle, I realized that, oh, yeah, this is what I should be doing. This is, you know, it's not the perfect job for everyone, but I think it's the perfect job for me. Like, I like writing, I like the sort of intellectual engagement, and I really like explaining things. I just love taking complicated things and explaining them. And apparently, as a law professor, that's what you get to do all day.
Great. Can I ask you before we talk about the law professor part? So you worked in London, you worked in Silicon Valley, you worked in Australia. Can you talk about the differences in the legal systems that you've experienced and the legal cultures in each of those places?
Oh, yeah. So they're all very different. I think in some ways, Australia and the UK are more conservative in terms of how they think about legal practice. I think it's really hard to sort of tease out like the experiences I had like from the country versus the firm. I felt that at Arnold Porter in London, I was given a huge amount of responsibility, possibly too much responsibility. And you know, I loved it there. I had a great time. I thought that the work I was doing was sort of interesting and challenging. And then when I went to Skadden Arps, you know, I felt like in that particular office, in that role, I was much more of a kind of cog in a machine. And, you know, I'm not sure that that has to do with the difference between America and the UK versus just the difference between doing like IT outsourcing at Arnold Porter versus doing merger and acquisition support at Skadden. Whereas, you know, when you're an IP person doing M&A support, like you are not the most important person in the room. You were just there to kind of check boxes, do some diligence, write some reports, negotiate some side licenses. But it's, you know, the tax people and the corporate people who are driving everything. So, you know, like, I mean, I'll be frank, I enjoyed my time at Arnold Porter much more. But I don't know if that's because it was England. I suspect it's more about the firm culture and the nature of the work I was doing. You know, yeah, and I should say, like, I worked with some great people at Skadden as well. I did some interesting work there, but you know, 3 years of M&A support is definitely like 1 year too many.
So looking back at the inflection points of both of your careers, was one person primarily the catalyst for the change and the other one, I suppose, complementing that, or how did it work?
Tonja is always the catalyst for change.
In every respect.
Yeah, no, so we, when we were in Australia, at one point we thought that maybe we were going to move to Sydney or to Melbourne for my career. That didn't end up happening, and instead we moved to California for Tonja's career.
But the point is, I agreed to move to Sydney for Matt's career.
Yeah. And you know, Sydney, San Francisco, it's the same. Yeah, but I think like, you know, we both wanted to live overseas. We both wanted that kind of horizon broadening experience. But, there's nothing quite so sort of crystallizing as, oh, you've been accepted into a PhD program. It starts on the 1st of August, right? Yeah, so, I think we have both supported each other. And I think that's.
And then the next big stage was when I finished my PhD, and then you have to be willing to go on the national market. Like, it's as simple as that. Like, people who want to go to a particular place, it's just completely unrealistic. So Matt stayed at Skadden for a year longer than he would have otherwise, because he knew that in a year I'd be finishing. And so that's why he had that year of drudgery. But otherwise, he probably would have made the move anyway. So it was more about timing, just because of the structured nature of the PhD. But when we moved 2 years ago, we moved from Chicago down to Atlanta to come to Emory, where we now both are. And that was very much we were both very interested in Emory. We were both interested in living in Atlanta. And it was a good time for both of us to make a move within our careers. So that, as we've sort of become more established, we've been less driven by outside forces and more driven by our own choices of, this is what we want. We really wanted to live in the Southeast. We loved Emory. We had such a positive impression, and it's turned out to be completely correct. Emory is fantastic, and we're both very happy here. And so I think when you're younger, early in your career, you don't necessarily have as much choice. And so later we were able to make a move that was sort of very much driven by where do we both want to end up.
Great, thanks. So, question about academic collaborations. I suppose there's a link there in terms of who's the catalyst and who complements. But both of you have worked with other people. Notably, both of you have worked with each other. I think when I did a word search, you had at least 12 pieces together now.
No.
Can that be right?
No, it's not that many.
Op-eds and everything else.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, op-eds. Oh, if you're counting op-eds, yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So talk about, I know, Tanya, you've worked a lot more with other people just as a norm. And Matt, I suppose maybe it's an IP thing as well. We don't normally collaborate with people quite as much. But talk about your experiences working with other people and your experiences working with each other.
Well, our experiences working with each other in terms of catalyst was always Zebo, our dog. We would go on long walks together while we walked Zebo, and we would just talk about ideas. Like, this is the great thing about being an academic. Your days are spent, talking about ideas, and we would always come up with something that we were both interested in, maybe had slightly different perspectives on or different skill sets. And so Zebo was the catalyst for most of our joint work. I really like working with other people. I feel like it always improves the work to have a different set of eyes on it. There are some things that you just, they're your creation and you have to do yourself. But the reason most of my work is co-authored, I think, is I have many projects that I want to work on my own, but I feel obliged to my co-authors. So I always prioritize the work that I'm doing with others, and my own stuff gets backburnered a bit. So I do sort of try and push myself to finish some of my separate work. But I do think generally that it's really great to work with someone else. Even if you think of yourself as having the same tool set, like if you're both law professors without, other degrees, you still have different perspectives, and you can still sort of spark ideas in each other and hold each other's feet to the flame a little, like, say, is this really true? Have you really looked into this? What about this other perspective? And so that makes the work better. But then if you add on to that, like if one of you is, a political scientist and one of you is a tech person, as in the case of Matt and my collaboration, like that brings a particular, a skill set combination as well as a substance and a methodological approach together. And that I think it makes the work better. There are projects that I probably, would never do if I wasn't writing them with Matt. So for example, at the moment, we're doing a follow-up to our earlier project looking at whether judicial ideology, my main area, and intellectual property, Matt's main area, actually influence each other in the standard way. And we did that project about 15 years ago, and now we're sort of saying, okay, is this still true? So I wouldn't have done the original project if it wasn't for working with Matt. and I wouldn't be doing the follow-up project either. And so there are some things that just come about because of that overlap of interests. So yeah.
And nobody else ever really has the same kind of synergy. It's almost serendipitous in a way.
Yeah, and also, you know, he can't escape me. I can say, where's the draft of the document? You can't be like, oh, I'm away from my email.
That's true. And I don't think every married couple should write together. Many of them absolutely shouldn't. But when it works, it really works. I mean, we we each know what the other one is good at, and you can kind of, you can shape the work and the workflow to really take advantage of that. So there are some things that we've written like really very quickly, because we could, we work well together. But yeah, I think
can you take us behind that process and tell us? So somebody comes up with the idea, you do a first draft, you send it to the other person, do you divvy things up from the beginning, and how does that final decision on how it looks look like?
A lot of our joint work is data driven, and so it starts with a sort of big idea, and usually, hopefully more than just a big idea of, oh, we have this data, maybe there's something interesting there. Like the big idea is actually kind of like I think this is what's going on here. So, Tonja had this theory that Supreme Court oral argument had really changed in the mid-1990s. And everyone knows that it really changed at some point. Oral argument today sounds quite different from oral argument in the 1960s. But the question is, when and exactly how and why. And, Tonja, being a political scientist, was like, yeah, well, it's the mid-90s and it's, Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution, and sort of increased polarization in society basically manifests on the court with the justices behaving more like advocates, right? And that was, that was the concept that we set up to kind of build data around and develop tools and test that. And so once you start with something like that, then there's a lot of playing around with the data and getting different data sets to talk to each other, and trying to see whether that theory cashes out. We're not going to talk about all the papers that we've started and the data doesn't cash out. We just bury those corpses in the backyard and don't speak of them. But yeah, so it kind of has a natural flow of, I get the data to behave and do some of the initial work, and then I throw it back to Tonja and like, so this is what the data says to me. What do you think? And then we sort of talk together on the interpretation. But then in terms of the writing, I mean, Tonja's a really great writer and she's a really fast writer. And so, once she's kind of set loose, then there's sort of things develop a momentum of their own. And, writing generates further questions about the data. And so that process is kind of iterative. Yeah, that's the way a lot of our collaborations work. Or at least that's the way they work from my point of view. Maybe Tonja's going to say something totally different.
No, that's right. It's just I was thinking about, I don't know how personal we want to get in this, but with that particular project that Matt was talking about, that was our first data. Well, no, it was our second data project, but that's when we sort of first started really looking at the Supreme Court work. And I was doing some work on it and I got hit by a truck and I got a pretty bad concussion and I couldn't look at the screen for many months. And Matt was supposed to be actually writing a book on fair use, and he just saw me going crazy, not being able to look at a screen. And he said, look, why don't I take the data and run start running regressions and we can talk about it, and I'll just print everything and we can look at the analysis together. And that's how we started this big Supreme Court project together. And it essentially, like, I would have gone completely insane if I couldn't have worked for months on end while I was recovering. So Matt's too modest. Like we sort of started this particular array, like, because when we did our first IP project together, we literally sat down in a room together and like wrote it word by word together. But that was pretty inefficient, and that was very early on. And now we sort of developed this pattern which works well. And also, I will never ever do a graph myself, because Matt is a master of doing graphics, and he just does beautiful graphs. And so we've stuck with that. So yeah, so it's I think that project particularly is very much a product of a marriage, because it was started because I needed help, and Matt helped me.
Thanks. I should also mention, I had mentioned this to you separately too, that I had the pleasure of assigning your article, We Are the AI Problem, to my students in Columbia. And so we had a chance to do a deep dive in it. Not too many numbers in that one, but certainly lots of pictures.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was quite different from most of our other stuff, in that, like, there was this issue that we actually started discussing before the Google Gemini kerfuffle, when Google's overly woke programming, triggered quite a backlash. We'd been discussing it beforehand because of some experiences we'd been having using the technology, and particularly some experiences Tonja had been having using the technology, of like, why are there no women here? So we, that one, I think we developed the ideas together and just sort of turned drafts like back and forth. Yeah, that's unusual. Normally there's more formal data.
So just talking globally about some of the issues that you all have really led on, like judges, copyright, AI, and the ranking that you've developed, Matt, forward-looking academic impact rankings. Talk to us about how you see leadership coming into this, and what, to use a word that's come up already a couple of times, catalyzed by things that you thought were important, and why you decided this was something that you wanted to do.
I'll talk about judges first, and then let Matt take the lead on the other topics. I was always interested in judicial behavior, and essentially my body of work in general is about strategic behavior by the Supreme Court justices, and showing that that the judges are quite canny in the way that they bring about the sort of outcomes that they want to. They bring about social change that they want to see. They shape doctrine. They bring about specific outcomes that they want, and how they go about that in a quite sophisticated way. And I think that is obviously relevant to your topic generally, in terms of thought, like the Supreme Court shapes American society to a very large extent. And so knowing how they go about making their decisions is really important to understanding society. And I think particularly in the US. So when we say the US Supreme Court is a particularly political institution, even though we can see a lot of the same patterns in other courts, it's just hugely impactful. And so when we talk about, thought leadership, how the Supreme Court justices address issues shapes, the very phraseology that we use, in political elections, in discussions with family, what have you. Like, it really is influential. And so I think understanding that is, really vital to understanding, the way society is the way it is. So I think obviously my area of study is important, but that's partly why, directly to that sort of the theme of this show. So yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to sort of see how other people see your work versus how you see it. Like, I don't, like, I've never thought of myself as a thought leader, right? But, like, I do have ideas, and I really strive in my academic work, not just to say what everyone else is saying, but to come up with something that is interesting, come up with something that either thinks a few steps ahead or takes a different perspective. But I think I've been working on copyright and how it relates to copy-reliant technology, the sort of computer processes that use copyrighted works, not really so anyone can enjoy the expression, but so that a machine can learn from the expression, and that produces data that is in some ways useful. I've been working on that since, I think 2009. And it turns out that, now that's like the central question, or one of the central questions in the regulation of AI. And, it's suddenly a whole lot more relevant to a whole lot more people. But the interesting thing that has happened is, because, I was quite early on some of the legal questions in AI, I find myself being a sort of a general resource on the social, political, cultural implications of AI. I find myself just explaining to journalists, no, this is how a large language model works. No, it's not like a magic thinking machine, et cetera. And, I have found I've sort of fallen into this role where, I really am like, an expert on AI broadly, partly just because people keep asking me these questions and I have to go figure out the answers. That's, that's definitely been one of the highlights of my career.
Where do you see your impact, both of you, going forward, both in terms of subject matter as well as perhaps thought leadership?
Yeah, I'll answer first. For me, I think, I think that some of the academic work that I have done has had an impact and will continue to have an impact, within the sort of space of copyright law. And, I feel sort of good about that. But more broadly, like, I think a lot of the impact I have is in community building, in organizing conferences and roundtables to bring other scholars together to kind of work with junior colleagues to help them get their careers off the ground. And, it's that, like, I never wanted to be an academic who just sat in my cave all day and thought great thoughts. For me, it's very much about, like, being engaged in a community, and that is really, I think, where my impact is.
Thanks, Tonja.
I would say, so earlier on in my career, I did a lot of formal modeling, like game theory of various sort of Supreme Court behaviors and doctrinal puzzles. And I really loved that work because it would make your brain, it would really test the boundaries of a certain type of thinking. And it was really interesting. And I think it was insightful in terms of what was going on, but it's quite mathematically complex. And so there were about, 6 people in the legal academy who could really read it, and they all thought it was great, but it didn't exactly have a huge impact. And so then when I started doing empirical work, a lot more people were interested. And I think Matt and I are both very good at explaining fairly complex empirical analysis in a way that is accessible to a legal community who are not necessarily very technical. And people were much more interested in that. They could engage with that. And I found that very satisfying. So that really pushed me to focus on more empirical work and less on theoretical work. At the same time, it was also, most of that empirical work is really focused on, finding these patterns of Supreme Court behavior and people, and particularly in relation to oral argument. And oral argument is particularly good to study because it's, it's the one part of the process that's actually, of the decision-making process that we can actually see. And so we all have these theories about how Supreme Court judges think and decide things and come up with doctrine, but here we can actually see it happening, and we can test theories about what's actually going on and show this to be true. And so particularly my empirical work on oral argument, it's been very influential. The Supreme Court itself has responded to, my work. And that is really exciting. I feel like, you want to have an impact. You don't just want to think your interesting thoughts and, have someone applaud and that's it. And so I definitely think the oral argument work, and I hope that, the next direction that we're planning on going in is going to be impactful as well, for similar reasons. But I think that bringing that empirical analysis, it can also, I also use it in the classroom, and I teach constitutional criminal procedure. So, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendments, all the issues about police power that are highly controversial and extremely sort of ideologically fraught. And I find that by introducing not just my own empirical work, but other people's empirical work, you can actually kind of lower the temperature a bit, because you can have a discussion about, well, what have we actually established is going on? Like, to what extent can we say, that this is a pattern of police behavior, this is the causes of police behavior, etc. And rather than just everybody having their opinions and shouting at each other, can actually be like, okay, well, let's engage with the facts as we know them. And so I think that is very powerful. And so both in terms of research and teaching, I think the empirical work has been very satisfying for me, but I also think it's the most impactful. And partly it's satisfying because it's impactful, but not only because of that, but I think that is the direction that I've found, that I think that's what I'm going to be known for. And it's also, it's incredibly fun to do.
Thank you. So final set of questions, and this goes to advice and reflections. Some of our listeners, many of them, in fact, are younger people, just starting off their careers. So I always ask this question of folks who have gone a little bit further ahead to reflect on what advice they would give to their younger selves.
Sometimes Matt and I say to each other that if we had any idea of how incredibly difficult and unlikely it was to have, succeeded in this way coming from Australia to America, like, we might not have done it. And so I'd sort of be a little bit cautious to give myself advice, because it might be, chances are it's not going to work out. Like, you have to be really good and really smart and really ambitious and determined, but you also have to be lucky. And so, things have worked out for us, but there are a lot of ways in which they could have not worked out. And so moving country and trying to establish yourself in such a sort of elite career without the sort of machinery behind you that most people have from having gone to, an Ivy League school and have this sort of machinery of professors who want you to do well and carry their name forward, is quite difficult. And we did it not knowing how difficult it would be, and it's worked out. But I don't know, I worry if I gave my younger self advice, it could backfire and just make me think it was going to be extremely challenging. So in some ways, I think, it was just the sort of the arrogance of youth that we thought we could do anything. I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah. I mean, I have the same hesitation of, I would be worried about, there are obviously things that I wish that I had known in some sense, but, I wouldn't have done anything differently. But I think more generally, I think, we have, I think to be successful at anything, you need to be ambitious. But in line with that, ambition, you also need, flexibility. You need to sort of see like, okay, this is what I want to achieve, but you need to keep your eyes open to, other opportunities that come up along the way. Like a lot of, where you end up is sort of serendipity. Like it'd be really boring to like finish college at the age of 22 and be like, okay, this is my next 30 years mapped out, right? This is what I'm going to do, exactly like this, and then I'm going to write this article and this book. It's like, no, like, the world keeps changing, you keep changing, different opportunities come up. I think, some of the best advice that I can give is like, like have a goal and pursue it, but also keep your eyes open for the things that are new and different opportunities that you just would never have even thought of. I mean, there are whole fields of study I didn't even know about until after I graduated university. And, certainly, like I did not predict that, I was going to be a professor of law in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science. Because, I mean, machine learning technically did exist for a long time, but not really, not in the sort of the way we understand it today. So yeah, that would be, other than, all the obvious cliche things, that would be my advice.
Thanks. And how do you guys keep a work-life balance?
That's a good question. We do.
Do we
both
keep a
really-
work-life balance?
We both really love our work, so we're lucky that we really enjoy doing what we're doing. But we do try and, we try and always take the weekends off. Like I know, we try not to check our email on the weekends. Matt does a lot of running. He runs marathons, and so that forces him to get out there. I walk the dogs, and they demand a fair bit of my time, so they keep me away from the computer. And yeah, I think you have to learn to sort of stop and think, okay, I'm productive. I don't need to stress out. I can take some time off and, I had a friend visiting last week, so I took like 4 days off while he was here. You have to at some stage say, it's enough. I can, we're doing well, we're productive. We don't need to always be chained to the desk. So yeah.
Right. Knowing when to stop, I think that's a good thing. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also, and something I've definitely learned from Tonja is like when you're working, really work, and when you're not working, really don't work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And like these people who are kind of always working are in some ways never working.
Yeah.
And I think you get,
Oh no, we've lost internet.
being focused. Oh, really?
Oh, we got you a bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I don't know. I think work-life balance is difficult for everyone to achieve. I think having things that are enjoyable, but also sort of non-negotiable so that you have to be more balanced is very helpful. So, for me, like I can't just go run a marathon. Like I have to do a lot of marathon training, and it's sort of like, but that's actually good for me. It's good to have like something that's kind of regular. Tonja loves playing with the dogs, but the dogs will also come tell you like, hello, it's time.
Yeah. Which it is now. I hear my dog woofing outside.
And so it's a great note to end on. I want to thank you, Tonja, Matt, for taking the time to speak to me and to our listeners. And we're excited to see what you have next, both in terms of your research, but in terms of all the other things that you do. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a
being with
pleasure.
us.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having me.
Daryl.
Thank you.